It also seeks to clarify documentation requirements for the use of accommodations and features by special populations. One of the things the webinar does not do is go into the details of each and every accommodation and accessibility feature, the step-by-step before, during, and after testing requirements, and also it just primarily features the overview for each of the assessments and similarities and differences across the assessments. Additional trainings will go more in depth into the weeds of each accommodation and accessibility feature for each assessment. So to start, all students in DC participate in assessments in one of three ways. This is important for us to start with, just so that we're all on the same page. So the first way is with a general assessment, PARC or DC Science. And then the second way is with accommodations, so PARC or DC Science with accommodations. And then the third way is with alternate assessments, so the Multi-State Alternate Assessment, or MSAA, or DC Science Alt. The alternate assessments, I do want to emphasize, those are primarily for students with significant cognitive disability, and a student with a significant cognitive disability has records that indicate a disability or multiple disabilities that significantly impact intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior. One conceptual anchor with the alternate assessments compared to the general assessment is that if a student, given all of the accommodations available in PARC and DC Science, if they're still not able to access the assessment and take it, then they might be a likely candidate for the alternate assessments. And so that's a very strong conceptual anchor. Eligibility for that is considered at a different time, but I do want to mention that just so that we're all on the same page about the assessments in DC and the requirements around them. So we want to emphasize that all of the assessments have accessibility features built into them. And accessibility features are for all students, but even with accessibility features, there are accommodations. And those are legal requirements that are due to students who have IEPs or 504 plans. I'll talk a little bit more about that in depth. But when we talk about accessibility to the assessments, this is the sort of conceptual framework that guides our thinking. First, we want to expect students to achieve grade level and course academic content standards. Then we learn about the accessibility features and accommodation, and this learning is for the instructors and also for the students. And these accessibility features and accommodations should be integrated into classroom use so that when assessment time comes, the students are able to use them, the teachers are able to know what they are, and test administrators and test coordinators can appropriately activate them. The third sort of step in this process of ensuring accessibility to all assessments is selecting the accessibility features and accommodations for individual students. And this really does happen at the individual student level, not school-wide, not classroom-wide. It's really per student. The fourth step is administering accessibility features and accommodations during the assessments and really making sure that they're appropriate. And then the last step is to evaluate and improve accessibility features and accommodations use. When talking about accommodations, I think it's important to describe the term special population. It is a legal one that covers a wide range of communities, but here at OSSE we use it to refer to 4 distinct groups of students who may receive accommodations on statewide assessments. Accommodations are intended to reduce the effects of a student's disability and/or English language proficiency level, but not to reduce learning expectations. So the first group of students who may receive accommodations include students with disabilities who have an individualized education program, or IEP. The second group of students includes students with a Section 504 plan who have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities where they have a record of such an impairment or they're regarded as having an impairment. While these students do not receive special education services, they're still classified as a student with disability. The third group indicates students who are English learners, and the fourth group includes students who are English learners and with disabilities who have an IEP or 504 plan. These students are eligible for both accommodations for students with disabilities and English learners. To provide a quick historical perspective about sort of accommodations and accessibility features, I do want to say that before IDEA and No Child Left Behind, and now we're in the era of the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, all students were not always included in the assessment process. The focus on accommodation has shifted from anything goes to inclusion and a focus on providing the right accommodations according to the right kind of assessment for the students who need it. And federal regulations stipulate states have policies on appropriate accommodations, that states monitor these policies and ensure valid measurement. And that's what we do here at OSSE on the assessment team, and we want to make sure that, you know, this sort of historical perspective is clear. One thing is that the accommodations always grow out of content and skills measured by the assessment and the purpose of the assessment, which is always linked back to instruction and content standards, where we started. Teams and committees, IEP teams and committees should consider the purpose and content of the assessment, as well as the individual student's need and circumstance when selecting accommodations. Another thing to consider is the timing and administration of the assessment in relation to accommodations. For example, the transcript, if a paper form needs to be transcribed, there's a protocol for that, and that protocol requires at least two persons at the school level to be present, and though they must receive test security training. And lastly, the inappropriate use of accommodation can and does negatively impact student achievement, and also the lack of it providing accommodations it definitely impacts student achievement. So we want to make sure that all students who need accommodations, as indicated on their IEP or 504 plan, they receive them. There are differences across assessments because the different assessments serve different purposes. So accommodations may be allowed for one test but not for another. You'll see this example mainly as it relates to access for ELLs and in relation to PARCC and DC Science. Access for ELLs is our English language proficiency test that is provided to students who are English learners every year. And that assessment has 4 language domains, and so the accommodations allowable for students who take that particular assessment really are only designed for students who are duly identified as English learners and students with disabilities. When considering an accommodation, it's important to consider the purpose of the test and, again, what it's designed to measure. I will also just mention that in DC we have, and also in the literature and in general, accommodations are categorized according to 4 different types. There are setting accommodations, timing and scheduling accommodations, presentation and response. I'll go into those a little bit more. I want to mention that this year, here are the test dates. The first assessment that is being offered is WIDA Access for ELLs, and that window opens on February 27th and closes right on April 25th. The MSAA is the alternate assessment that is only available for students who are not taking PARCC and who are eligible for the alternate assessment. And that opens on March 27th. And then the PARCC window, there are 2 of them. More will be described in later trainings about the selection of them and communicating that to the assessment team. But I do want to showcase these dates here and then mention that DC Science overlaps with the second park window from April 24th through June 9th. And then the DC Science alternate assessment is the alternate version of DC Science, and that's a portfolio-based assessment, and the portfolios get submitted on the May 26th. I'm going to pause here for questions and just to monitor what's the activity in the chat box and see if there are any things that I need to address before moving on to the next section. There don't seem to be any questions yet. Feel free to type them as you have them. I do want to mention that the copy of the PowerPoint is available to download right now in the handout section of this webinar, and it's in PDF format. Moving on to WIDA Access for ELLs. Again, the test window is from February 27th through April 25th. And I just want to be reminding you of the dates as they're coming up very quickly here now that we're in 2017. Yeah, that's right. Happy New Year. So in the fall of 2016, OSCE released a new guidebook for delivering education services to English learners. That's available on the Learn DC site. Some of you may already know about this. For those of you who have English learners at your LEA or schools, this is a very important guidebook as it provides it concretizes the policies that we have available and makes it and puts it in one place. And so this guidebook will be updated annually. The second version of this guidebook will come out probably in the summer around the time of the EL Institute. So please be looking for that. But know that this year's version is already available on the website and it's ready for downloading. I do want to mention the test administration timeline, even though I've been mentioning the dates pretty regularly as I've been talking, but I do want to call attention to one thing here, and that's around the additional test material window. You'll see that the additional test material window opens on February 10th, and it ends about a week before the test window ends for WIDA Access for ELLs. I call attention to this date because the end of this week, OSCE will upload the pre-ID file, which is essentially the roster of all of the English learners taking the Access for ELLs assessment this year. We'll upload that on Friday. WIDA will receive that, and when they receive that, there will be a lag time between the 6th and the 10th. So between the January 6th and February 10th, you may receive students at your LEA, you may receive English learners who might need to take the Access for ELLs assessment. If that does indeed happen, if they're then screened and identified and need to take the assessment, you would then go into the assessment management system for WIDA and order additional tests. And the test is administered online, so unless they have a paper-based accommodation, you can just go and add them online. And so it's kind of an easy way to do that, and that starts on, you can start doing that for those students that you may receive between now and February 10th. If you receive students within the test window, so the test window opens on the 27th, say you, for example, there's a student who comes March 15th, you can then also go into the WIDA assessment management system and add those students as they come. And that's sort of an easy way to do that at the LEA level. I'm going to jump into sort of this notion of universal design, and the reason why I'm sort of focusing on this is because it provides a base for the accessibility and accommodations that are available. And this is true across assessments, but I'm focused specifically on WIDA access for ELLs. We're starting with that assessment in this webinar because that's the first assessment that is administered. That's the first test window that we have this year in DC. So as you can see from this graphic, this framework provides support for all English learners as well as more targeted accommodations for students with IEPs or 504 plans at the top. So these supports will help all English learners with and without an IEP to better access the test. And this idea of universal design is based on principles used while the test was being developed online and in its paper-based version. These test delivery options were developed to ensure a balance between accessibility and usability. And the test items are presented using multiple modalities, including support prompts with graphics, embedded scaffolding, tasks broken into chunks, and modeling using task prototypes and guides. The next section of the accessibility and accommodations framework is administrative considerations. So these individualized administration procedures provide flexibility to districts or schools in determining the conditions under which access for ELLs can be administered most effectively. Test security may not be compromised. I want to emphasize that. And administrative considerations may not change what the test items are designed to measure or the way test scores are interpreted. And that's just basic sort of test security and validity protocol. And I want to mention universal tools. Universal tools in the Access for ELLs framework is the same as accessibility features in PARC. There are different terminologies across the different assessments, but conceptually I want to make sure that folks understand so that we're not confused. The different names for more or less the same thing. So with these universal tools or accessibility features, these might be embedded online or provided by test administrators during testing, and it's important that students become familiar with the appropriate use and availability of these universal tools. These should reinforce students' abilities to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. And accommodations are at the very top of the triangle, and they're only available to those duly identified students. So students with a documented IEP, with a documented disability on their IEP or 504 plan. And accommodations are allowable changes to the way the test is presented, the way a student may respond, the timing, or the environment. So those 4 categories that I mentioned, those are the kinds of accommodations that are available for this assessment as well as for all of the assessments. And providing the appropriate accommodations that don't change what's being measured is required by both state and federal law. Moving on to the universal tools, I sort of want to show you some examples of them, these accessibility features for the Access for ELLs assessment. They have color contrast, they have highlighter, scratch paper, sticky notes, color overlay, and audio aid magnification. And these are the general accessibility features. Before I go on to accommodated forms, I want to make sure that I pause here to address 2 questions that we've received in the question chat box. I received a couple of questions in the question chat box. One of them has to do with when the test integrity guidelines for 2017 will be released. I do not have the dates for that at this moment. At the next NGA meeting, those will be announced. And then the next question I have as it relates to access for ELLs, the question is, how does OSCE submit the materials order without knowing what tier the students are in? And I do want to mention this about the tiers. With access for ELLs, it's divided into 3 tiers, but this is where it's differed. The new version of the assessment being online as of last year eliminates a selection of tiers. So because the assessment is administered online, as a student is taking the assessment, the tiers are generated based on student responses. For the kindergarten version of access, that still has to be selected by the teacher. And for additional questions related to that, you can contact me, Lanisha, and Danielle, and we can provide additional guidance on that for kindergarten. But for all of the other grades, the tier selection is no longer necessary if a student isn't taking, if the student is taking the assessment on the computer. If they're taking the paper-based version of the assessment, you will have to follow the WIDA guidelines for tier selection like it was done in the past. I hope that answers your question. Moving on to access for ELLs accommodated forms, I want to mention this notion of most accommodations being used with online or paper-based testing. Some of them do not need to be identified in advance, but there are 3 in particular that must be pre-identified when using the computer-based testing. So these accommodations make changes to the testing platform which allow the student to access the accommodation. So essentially, depending on the kind of accommodation the student has, it affects the kind of test that they take. So these really need to be clearly identified. The first one is extended speaking test response time, manual control of the item audio, and repeating the items in audio form. One question that I've received quite a bit via email has to do with whether or not students who might need large print should do a paper-based version or online. So it's important to use the practice tests and sample items to determine what might work best for the student. Again, the accommodations should be reflective of what's happening during instruction. So if a student is more comfortable and you typically teach according to large paper-based print, then that might be the best sort of form for that student. One thing you should know is that if you use a paper-based large print version of Access, it's an 18 points font, whereas if you do it online, you can use a magnification tool for large print, which will increase these font size up to 1.5 or 2 times the amount, and the graphics also become enlarged accordingly, but that's confined by how large the monitor is. WIDA doesn't recommend the use of tablets or Chromebooks for students who have large print needs, and that's very important just because of the size of the screen, and it really does affect how a student may access that. And if the student needs large print for an accommodation, it's best to use whatever might work better for the student. I know historically some folks have chosen to use a paper-based test and any other magnification tools that they might need for the students. WIDA puts out a lot of information and materials, and they have trainings and all kinds of things on the WIDA website. So they released for this year an accessibility and accommodation supplement, and this supplement really provides participation guidance, a framework. It outlines the types of support that are necessary for each accommodation. It outlines that alternate access for ELLs criteria. So I mentioned the alternate assessments in relation to Park and DC Science, but there's also an alternate version of WIDA Access for ELLs, which is our annual assessment of English language proficiency. WIDA is only for students who speak a language other than English at home, and then who do not pass a screener assessment, and the screener assessment is designed to measure their proficiency in English. So if they speak another language and they aren't at English language proficiency equivalent to native speakers, then they take access every year. And if they have a significant cognitive disability, then they take the alternate access for ELLs. That guidance, that criteria is outlined here in the accessibility and accommodation supplement. There's also transcription guidance, scribe guidance, and an accommodations checklist. WIDA, the way it rolls out as an assessment, there are 4 different language domains. So each language domain, and those 4 different language domains, those are like 4 different tests. So each of those may have, if a student is duly identified as an English learner and a student with disabilities, they may need accommodations for all of those domains. However, some of the domains accommodations may not be allowed. So you would want to use the accommodation checklist that WIDA puts out to see what that looks like. Here's a screenshot of the WIDA website. This is where WIDA has 2 websites. There's one, this is the general WIDA website. So this is where you go for information about the assessment. You want to receive the interactive checklists. You want to download the accommodations manuals, the training. You want to access training modules, FAQs, and in order to complete the training that you need to do, you go to the WIDA website. Login is required for some resources, and your ELL coordinators at the LEA will be able to add new users. Now, there's also a WIDA assessment management system. This is called the WIDA AMS, and this contains test software, test demos, sample items, and essentially if you want to access the WIDA AMS, you'll need login credentials, and you'll have to receive those from your LEA ELL coordinator. All students will be loaded into the WIDA AMS, whether they're taking paper or the paper-based version. So if they're taking access, they're going to be in the system. You'll be able to view students at your LEA in the system once the additional test materials window opens, and that happens on February 10th. Here's a screenshot again of the WIDA AMS. Here's a hyperlink. You would go here to log in. If you need login credentials, you'll need to contact your LEA ELL coordinator, and if that person has changed or you're not sure, then you would want to contact aussie.assessment@dc.gov. Here's a screenshot of where you go to access the sample items. You want to go into the WIDA assessment management system to see the sample items. The sample items, you'll be able to view a PDF version of them, but you can also practice the test to see how it looks in the test platform. And that you do in the WIDA assessment management system. So you want to do that to sort of see the differences between the large print, maybe what it might look like on paper versus the magnification tool that you would use to provide large print to students who might need it. So you would want to probably go and see the sample items and also practice the test to sort of see what it looks like. If you're not familiar, there haven't been too many more changes from the year before. But it's always good to go in there now. And again, the test window opens for that assessment for WIDA Access for ELLs on February 27th. I'm going to pause here before jumping into Park to see if there are any questions and to address them. I received a few questions in the question chat box. The first one is related to identifying accommodations on top of the ones that were indicated on the preliminary roster submitted to OSSE on November 22nd. To that, I want to say, if a student, if between now and then, or then and now, a student may need additional accommodations, or maybe you submitted the roster and the accommodations were not specified, particularly around the 3 accommodations that you need to have pre-identified in order to take access, then those will need to be indicated. You can wait until the test window opens to see to make those changes, because the test window opens about 2 weeks before we take, the additional test material, the additional test materials window opens 2 weeks before the test window opens. So you can double check those accommodations and then further specify them at that point. So that's February 10th. The next question is related to sort of a crosswalk between accommodations and accessibility features for WIDA and ones that you might see in SEDS. I think that we could do maybe provide a helpful tool so that if there are differences in terms of how things are named in SEDS and what they're named in the WIDA materials, that might be of use. To do an additional crosswalk, we think it's most helpful to use what WIDA puts out, which they have a checklist for what's allowed for each of the language domains and which accommodations they say, this isn't allowed, this is allowed, and it's pretty clear. That's the checklist, and that is what we want to use. And what we can do at OSSE is provide some nomenclature cleanup. So maybe they call repeat item audio one thing, and we call it, something else instead. So we'll pretty much list all of those so that it makes it easier for you to identify what those accommodations are in SEDS. But we're not going to do like another long crosswalk or anything like that. We'll use the checklist that WIDA puts out and then sort of make references to what we call things in SEDS. So a crosswalk light, we'll call it. Thank you for that question. And then the next question has to do with sort of identifying tiers, selecting tiers and whatnot. And I'm going to address that offline, but I do want to say that I always reference the WIDA guidance because they're our vendor, and I will pretty much point you to that, but I'll clarify a few things for selecting tiers. Tier selection was a practice that was pretty common before the test went online. Now there is no need really for wide scale or large scale tier selection as the computer generates the tiers for most students. But for earlier years, it is a different story, and so I will address those offline. Thank you. So moving on to PARC. The first test window opens on April 10th, goes through May 26th. The second window opens on April 24th, and it goes to June 5th. In the NGA meeting, the next one that's coming up, folks will outline sort of requirements around communicating when your test window is, your test plan, and all of that fun stuff that happens in the spring around assessment. So we have the PARC 5th edition of the Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual. It has been released, and it's available to download from the PARC website. This is what it looks like, a quick screenshot. It's in black and white this year. And yeah, you go to that link to download it. I want to sort of jump into this notion of accessibility features that are available to all students, so those built into the design. Accessibility features identified in advance, so these administrative considerations, things that need to be pretty much specified in the PMP for students ahead of time, and some of them are administrative considerations, but they need to be considered and really dealt with before. And then the accommodations for students. So this is very similar to what I outlined with the accessibility and accommodations framework for WIDA Access for ELLs. I think typically in the past we've split these up, and this year we're sort of talking about them in relationship to each other, or we're trying to. So as you all know, as I've explained, we have these 3 content-specific statewide assessment. There's DC Science, and then there are the 2 for math and English language arts with PARC. And so these are how pretty much accessibility features and accommodations are divvied up. So the PARC assessment includes several accessibility features built into the system that all students can access. Then we have accessibility features that are for any student, but they must be identified in advance. And this is where the PMP specification becomes really important. And then we also have accommodations, and these are only available to students with disabilities. They have an IEP or 504 plan, and others for English learners. And accommodations must be documented in some plan, the IEP 504 ELL plan, and they must also be identified in the student's personal needs profile, or PNP. I've listed some examples of each type of feature. So accessibility features, to remind you guys, is pop-up glossary, external spell check, line reader mask tool, repetition of directions. These are already built into the test. Any student can access it, but I want to emphasize that maybe not all students should access these. It's mainly for students if they're familiar with using them, if they've used it before, they've tested. There are a lot of accessibility features, and I think if students haven't practiced with them, using for the first time during the assessment would be very tough. So I just want to emphasize that. There are accessibility features that must be identified in advance. There's one huge change related to this this year, and that's around the student reading aloud to him or herself. Last year that was an accommodation. Now it's an accessibility feature, but it's an administrative consideration that because a student reading out loud is going to potentially disrupt other students, right? So that's something that needs to be considered ahead of time. Frequent breaks and small group testing are also administrative considerations. And then the text-to-speech for math is an accessibility feature that also must be identified in advance. Accommodations, the examples for them are screen reader, paper-based test, the read aloud, human signer. And for English learners, that's the translation of math, and then the word-to-word dictionary. So I want to talk about the ELA read aloud. Last year we did better in terms of not over prescribing this for students, but I really just want to make sure that it's focused on that this accommodation is not intended for a student reading somewhat or moderately below grade level. This accommodation is really only for a very select number of students, small select number of students who cannot decode, and they have a disability that's documented that severely limits them from accessing printed text, and they really cannot, make sense of it, of reading it without this accommodation. So again, you want to use Appendix D, which is a checklist in the PARC manual to to figure out if this is the right accommodation for a student. It helps the IP team determine its appropriateness. And I think this is a screenshot of the Appendix D, and there are some questions, some considerations that should be used when deciding if the ELA read aloud is appropriate for the student. I also want to mention something about read aloud as an accessibility feature. Now, we tend not to think about read aloud, but essentially read aloud is equivalent to text to speech. And I want to call it what it is for this reason. So given that reading comprehension on Park Math and DC Science isn't measured, right, because we're measuring the knowledge of the content, so math and science, it's allowable to provide the read aloud to any student with an identified need. Now, it's an accessibility feature. So some folks have historically thought that that means every and any student should get read aloud. However, text-to-speech is, it may impede on a student taking on the assessment. Even if read aloud might help them, text-to-speech should be provided to students who practice. These accessibility features are, they should be consistent with daily instruction, and again, they shouldn't be administered school-wide or LEA-wide because it's really to help the students on the assessment. But if they don't generally use it, then the assessment is not the appropriate time to try and practice use it just because it's available for every student. I do want to belabor that point, don't mean to beat the horse dead, but it's very important that this notion of accessibility feature for all really is thoughtful for all, because students it shouldn't just be for every student just because they could. And I do want to say that. So the most common accommodation that we encounter are the paper-based accommodations, because the assessments are on the computer and there are paper-based versions. And I put a link here to the accessibility and accommodations manual. I do want to emphasize sort of the transcribing needs around Braille, large print, and Spanish for math. Because the transcription process must be followed according to the test coordinator manual directions before turning that into Park. And it's pretty much Appendix C in the manual. It's a protocol for using a scribe during accommodations. And I do want to mention this just because there seems to be some confusion around it, but also there is pretty labor intensive in terms of the requirement. So at least 2 persons must be present when the scribe accommodation is given, and so, or when a test is, when the scribe accommodation is given. But these assessments must be transcribed, and I just want to mention that. We have some implementation guidance for Park. Again, this is very high level, but I want to emphasize it to get you all to start thinking about it. It's the same as last year, but these again are the accommodations that are most common. Extended time, so individual test units may last up to 1 school day, so it's essentially 1 unit per day, and 1 unit cannot be split over multiple days. That's pretty much a Park policy. There are calculator guidelines. If you click this hyperlink, it'll send you to a 10 or 11 page printout of what those guidelines are. There are paper tests that are available, like I mentioned, and text-to-speech or read-aloud accommodations. Students may test in a room with their peers with headphones, and text-to-speech can be made available to any student for math. But again, it's not widely used, and there's guidance around that. I'm going to pause here for additional questions related to Park before moving on to DC. So I received one just quick question about protocol related to accessing information. The PDF of the presentation that I'm showcasing now is available in the handout section of the webinar. And the hyperlinks, you should be able to open the PDF and then click the hyperlinks and then go to the links. And then I'm receiving a question about if a student can, students who are taking the paper test at the same time as students taking the assessment on the computer. That's sort of a regulatory logistics question. I think it's better to ask during the NGA meeting and during the test integrity training. I think in terms of how the accommodations are rolled out and how you design that test setup, there isn't an issue with that. There may be some test security sensitivities that you might want to be aware of, and that will be addressed at a later time. So I'm getting a few questions about Appendix C on the PARC website. I'm going to pause here to show you Appendix C for the scribe accommodations. Okay, so the question was related to what I was mentioning about at least two persons being present. And this is Appendix C in the AFNA manual on Avocet here. So if a student's responses must be transcribed after test administration is completed, the following steps must be followed. At least two persons must be present during any transcription of student responses. So one of these persons will be the transcriber, and the other will be an observer confirming the accuracy of the transcription. And that's what I was talking about. So when we're doing Braille or a paper-based version of the assessment and things need to be transcribed, the protocols outlined in Appendix C must be followed. So this is something that you would want to consider before you're planning to administer the assessment. This is for PARC. I'm going to go back to the question chat box to see what other questions are popping up there. So moving on to DC Science, there's not very much left here, but I do want to say the window is from April 25th to June 9th. So it overlaps with that second PARC window. But it doesn't combine with the WIDA Access for ELL's window. So DC Science uses an identical assessment platform and registration system as PARC. So you'll have Pearson Access Next and TestNav 8. And this year what's new is that the accommodations align more closely to PARC. So for example, last year we were calling, and for science it was audio form. This year it's called text-to-speech. So these updates for the accommodations for DC Science will be highlighted in the 2016-17 crosswalk and testing accommodations manuals. These are going to be released before February 1st. And they're going to be discussed more in depth at the LEA Special Education PLC monthly webinar that Annette Thacker Bartlett does, and that is on January 18th from 10 to 11 a.m. If you click this hyperlink, you can, if you click this hyperlink, you'll be able to register for the webinar. In wrapping up, I do want to summarize a couple things. So students eligible for accommodations include students with disabilities, so the students with individualized educational programs or plans, students served under Section 504, English learners, students qualifying for English language services, English learners who have disabilities, and students who have exited English language services in the last 2 years in EL monitoring status. So I want to emphasize the monitoring status students. Some of them may be very advanced, but they could take advantage of a word-to-word dictionary when taking, say, Park Math or something. And so those students should have accommodations made available to them, too. They often get overlooked. And I think under DC CAS, there were some differences between what was allowed for English learners when compared to Park. So I just want to highlight that for folks. I do also want to mention that when preparing for personal needs profiles, or the PNP, so the PNP is extremely important for a number of reasons, and it's a record for the accommodations that are provided to students. It's also a record for accommodations that need to be pre-identified in order for the student to even take the assessment. So these are the computer-based accommodated test forms. So for example, text-to-speech and the Spanish math test. So if you don't identify those in advance, then the student isn't going to receive the right form of the test. So we call these accommodated test forms, right? And so it's essentially a high impact error if these are not identified in the accurate student personal needs profile, because if a student starts taking a test that they start taking the wrong accommodated form of the test. So they need text-to-speech, but they don't receive it. Then if you catch it, then it must be stopped, a new test ticket must be printed, they have to take a new form of the test. If you don't catch it early enough, then we have to invalidate the test, and then they have to be take a new one. And so it's very a lot of high-touch problem solving there. But essentially, this can be resolved if you know that a student needs an accommodated test form on the computer, and you can identify that in the personal needs profile. So it's best to avoid any of these issues by finalizing all the PNP data before proctor caching or starting any of the test sessions and checking the form ID. There's a full step-by-step guidance, which I'm not going to go into. However, I will say that in managing the PNP, these are the different kinds of computer-based accommodated test forms. There's ASL video. So the ASL is demonstrated for a lot of the tests, and if it's not identified in the PNP, it will not activate for the student. Assistive technology, the screen reader, assistive technology, non-screen reader version, closed captioning for ELA and literacy, text-to-speech, translation of Park Math, and human reader or human signer. This is extremely important. It's also extremely important that accommodations and accessibility features used on assessments are also used in instructions. So any unique or non-standard accommodations not included in the manuals for Any of the assessments must be approved by OSCE prior to their use on the statewide assessments. And unique accommodation guidance is coming out. Annette will touch on it more in her webinar on the 18th, but something you should be thinking about is your test window, because the unique accommodation forms need to be submitted 6 weeks before the assessment begins. For Park in DC Science, a student needs to be familiar and comfortable with all accommodations and accessibility features before the assessment. This is extremely important because you can get the practice tests and tutorials. Those are excellent resources online. Emergency accommodations will be available for any students as temporary accommodations in the event of a student injury. So kid breaks his arm or wrist and can't, type or write, then there'll be an emergency accommodation process for that, just like last year. And then guidelines to selecting, implementing, and evaluating the use of accommodations for students with disabilities and English learners. Once the manuals are finished at the end of the month, they'll be available at this link. In the meantime, the Park 5th edition of the manual is ready to download and on the Park Avocet website, and that's an excellent resource for kind of getting ready for the different accommodations that are coming with Park. There's also additional training resources. I mentioned Annette's LEA Special Education Point of Contact webinar, which is happening on January 18th. You can register for it here by clicking this hyperlink if you haven't already. And in this webinar, it's going to dive deep on accommodations for students with disabilities, such as documenting the assessment accommodations in the IEP. So really good walkthrough of what that looks like in SEDS. And then unique accommodation requests, how that process works, what are the forms, what do you do in the OST, how does that look? There will be beautiful screenshots of that. And then alternate assessment accommodations, we didn't touch on that here, but that will be highlighted in the next webinar. Accommodations for NAEP, and any other resources that IEP teams and LEAs can use. And I do want to say that the LEA Special Education Points of Contact should plan to participate, but test coordinators and test administrators are also welcome to participate. In that webinar, it'll talk about the accommodations in relationship to each other. In this webinar, I tried to sort of highlight the bigger picture accessibility and accommodations, the differences for each assessment, but in that webinar, it'll really show you the side-by-sides of them. All materials from this webinar will be posted on this website. The webinar is being recorded, so you'll be able to watch it again if you so choose. This is the assessment team, and any questions really should be directed to the OSCE assessment at dc.gov and the Director of Assessments, Danielle Branson. And if you need if you or any of your test coordinators or test administrators need a login for the WIDA or MSAA websites, then you'll have to click this link, and this is really for if the LEA ELL coordinator or your LEA alternate assessment coordinator isn't able to do it, but if people need it fast, then they want to use this link and request to have login credentials. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I'm going to pause now here. We have about another 15 to 20 minutes for questions. I'm going to pause, mention one more time that the handouts, in the handout section of the webinar, you can download the PDF version of this presentation right now. So I'll pause for questions, and then please type in the question chat box if you have questions. And again, we'll be here for another 15 to 20 minutes. audio form. Okay. So I received a very important hot question in the question chat box, and it was related to audio form for science. So this year, this is a new change. Audio form is no longer an accommodation. We heard you. We heard the feedback. We not only heard, but we actually listened to it. And we made a change. And so now, for science, it's called text-to-speech. And similar to Park, text-to-speech is an accessibility feature available to all students. However, I do want to say it's available to all students with the consideration that all those students who might need it are familiar with using it and might find it helpful. So crosswalk light doesn't exist yet. However, it will. In the meantime, okay, I'm going to show you on the WIDA website. Okay, so this checklist, assessment, access for ELLs, this, let's see, this checklist I was talking about is here. Give me 1 second. That's the supplement, right? Checklist. I have the checklist on my computer, but I don't want to show you all the files. So I'm trying to show you how, as if you're just going in here and trying to find it. I'm also going in here and trying to find it. Clearly not the most user-friendly thing. And when in doubt, beauty of Google. Yes, this is the checklist. This checklist shows you, this is what I was talking about, where I was saying we're going to use this checklist. This is a checklist from WIDA, and it shows you the accommodations for each of the domains. So repeat item audio, for example, that's available as an accommodation for listening and speaking, but it's not allowed for reading. And so essentially, this key information describes, this column describes the accommodation and whatnot. But you see that the names of these the names of these accommodations are not the same as what you would see in SEDS. So the crosswalk light that I was talking about before is pretty much going to be like a table, more or less, with these accommodations grouped according to the 4 categories that you would see in SEDS. And essentially we say, this large print version is an accommodation. It's called, it's like large print. That's the easiest one I can do off the top in SEDS. And so you see it there under presentation. It's a presentation accommodation, right? So that's what I mean to describe about a crosswalk light. It doesn't exist yet, but it will, and it will be up on the OSCE website before the end of the month with the crosswalks. I'm going to go back to the questions. So a question we received about sort of accommodations manual equivalent for science. There won't be a like Park, for example, has a 400 some odd pages of um, appendices and step by step as part of our contract with Park, and to sort of outline differences across the states in that manual, and also similarities across all of the Park states. We will not have a version of that for science. What we do have for science, and what we will have before the end of the month, is our DC-specific accommodations manuals in parts 1 and 2. Part 1 will be featured on focused on students with disabilities. Part 2 will be focused on English language learners. And in that, similar to last year, we will outline all of the accommodations available for Park, DC Science, and yeah, for Park and DC Science. Sorry, it's Park ELA Literacy, Park Math, and DC Science. And so that's where you'll see the equivalent of those, and then some of the distinctions that were true last year will not be true this year. That one example that I gave about audio form and text to speech, and so where those there are similarities that are more aligned, then it would be the same kind of guidance as outlined for Park for DC Science.
Question I'm going to look into later.
I'm going to look through the questions to see if there are others that I have not addressed. So receiving some questions about sort of follow-ups, next steps, moving on to the next thing, more specific, more in-depth. On the 18th, Annette's going to do another accommodations webinar, but it's going to be, like I said, more specific on the similarities and differences crossing between them, crosswalk style, and a focus on alternate assessments. There will be additional trainings that I didn't touch on in this webinar. There will be one specifically on the PNP. Cassie Lynett from the assessment team is probably going to be giving that one. You want to keep an eye out for the NGA bulletins that come out weekly. In the NGA bulletins, they pretty much outline what trainings are coming down the road. That's like our assessment sort of short, quick, and to the point version of the LEA Look Forward, where it has all things Aussie, but the NGA bulletin is just focused on assessment. So we're going to outline the trainings there. Those will be, the NGA bulletin should come out this week, or at the end of this week, or next week, early next week. Additionally, at the NGA meeting, there will be like a very well fleshing out of dates for this spring, because the first test window is going to open on February 27th, and we're very mindful on the assessment team of where we're at in the calendar year, it being January 3rd, and the test window opening is right around the corner. So we really are taking that into consideration, and we'll get those dates out to you shortly.
Email to
There don't seem to be any other additional questions coming through the question chat box. If there are additional questions and you do have them, please email aussie.assessment@dc.gov and the Director of Assessments, Danielle Branson. And your questions will be addressed. But make sure you email the director and the general Aussie email. I'll hang on here for another minute or two, and then I'll say goodbye to you all. I am going to end the webinar, but let's continue the conversation. So please, if you have additional questions, email aussie.assessment@dc.gov and CC the Director of Assessments, and catch you on the flip side. Thank you.